able to, if you think that might help you, please feel free to go ahead and pull up those notes, and you can follow along as we go through this lecture. So this evening we are dealing with the books of Joshua and Judges, and this is the beginning of a new kind of a segment in our course. I want to draw your memory back to the first lecture we had, which talked about the divisions of the Hebrew Bible. You should remember, I hope, that there is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. These together make up what is sometimes called the Tanakh. So we spent a couple lectures in the Torah. We looked at the creation accounts. We looked at the patriarchal period in the Exodus. And now we are beginning the next section of the Hebrew Bible, the division. And this is called the Nevi'im, which means prophets in Hebrew. So, Beatrice, I see your comment. The reason they're being denied is because they're not using their ANU email address. If they use the correct email, they will be able to enter with no problem. I have an app or a plugin now that I've used, which automatically denies anybody who's trying to use a non-ANU email address. So bear that in mind. Now, as we prepare to begin this chunk, this division of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im, the prophets, it is necessary to have the context here. I had somebody last evening ask an interesting question, actually, about why we skipped some of the books in the Torah. Part of that is because the length of our course, 14 weeks, it's not possible to cover every single book, but also because the books that we passed over, Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, feature a lot of laws that are important, but there's a lot of repetition in there. And so one of the things I want to do before we begin looking directly at Joshua and Judges is actually to summarize a little bit the book of Deuteronomy for us. And there's a very important reason for that. Some scholars, so within the division of the Nevi'im, the prophets, there is sometimes called the former prophets, which deals with the books we're looking at. And you should know that word. That's an important idea. Former prophets. I'll put that in the chat. That deals with Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings. And another way that these books are sometimes identified is the Deuteronomistic history. That's kind of a long, term. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat as well, because this is also very important for us to know. The Deuteronomistic history. So the idea behind this concept that scholars use to talk about these books is that they are really a congruent, a single work that was written by one author, although most people now think probably a group of people working together, written and then editing these. But the point is that these books together bear some resemblance. They have a common thread that connects back to the book of Deuteronomy. So most people would talk about the book of Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Torah, functioning as sort of a preface to the books that come next. So it's important, it's relevant for us to cover a little bit, just for a few minutes here, what the book of Deuteronomy talks about. Does anybody remember, Reverend Kasoy, I think, mentioned this last week. Does anybody remember what the term Deuteronomy means? Or does anybody know and would like to share? All right, that's okay. I will tell you. Deuteronomy is basically two words. Deutero, first word, means second. And the second part, nami, comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. So traditionally, the book of Deuteronomy has been understood to be a kind of a second giving of the law that we discussed last week, the law that was first given at Mount Sinai there. And one of the reasons for this is that you remember Moses disobeyed God, and from the disobedience in general, people had to they were not permitted to enter into the promised land. God told them they were going to wander around the wilderness for 40 years. And so basically the old generation that was disobedient, they died off. And so now the setting for the book of Deuteronomy is that the people are camped right at the edge of the Jordan River, and they're preparing finally after 40 years to enter into the promised land. And before they do that, God wants them to have a refresher course, a reminder about the law and how important it is. And especially because they're going into this land of Canaan, the promised land that is occupied by very wicked, by very sinful people. One of the big ideas of the book of Deuteronomy, well, I'll kind of cover three of them here. Some of the big themes. Sounds like somebody is not muted. I will mute you. Okay. Three of the big themes that are contained in the book of Deuteronomy have to do with really reminding these people of Israel about all the miracles that God had done to bring them out of Egypt, okay? Because after 40 years, some of the old people had forgotten or died off. They also are reminded of their covenant relationship that was established, first with Abraham, of course, and then at Mount Sinai. And as I mentioned already, they are warned in very particular ways about the importance of obeying God and not worshiping the idols or mimicking the behavior of the people who are inhabiting the land of Canaan. And towards the end of Deuteronomy, there's a very important chapter, Deuteronomy 28, chapter 28. Put this in the chat. If you want to go through and read this, it's interesting because there's a list of things that will happen if the people are obedient. And then there's a list of curses, really, blessings and curses. And so God makes it very clear. You have this incredible start. I'm fulfilling this part of the promise to give you the land. But if you are disobedient, if you behave like the sinful people who are living there right now, then the same things are going to happen to you. And indeed, sorry to give a bit of a spoiler, but just as God is using the Israelites in the book of Joshua to drive out wicked people from the land, in a few hundred years, the Israelites themselves are going to be driven out because of their own wickedness and sinfulness. Okay. Now, that's kind of a summary of the book of Deuteronomy, and this is an important kind of handoff. Moses is giving this kind of last sermon, but he is not permitted to cross the Jordan. So there's a handoff to Joshua, and we will begin addressing that there. But I want to, before we get to Joshua, go back actually to the book of Genesis, because this is going to be a kind of a prophetic indication or a prophetic setting of the context for what we're going to be dealing with in Joshua and Judges. So way back in Genesis 15, I'll start in verse 13. This God is talking about their time in Egypt, but also it talks about the land that they're about to enter and some of the people there. So this is beginning in verse 13. The Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign country. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. And so that's the time they spent in Egypt that we talked about. But I will execute judgment on the nation that they will serve, and they will come out with many of the possessions." So we discussed that in the Exodus. God judged the gods of Egypt in a very decisive manner. And then the people come out of Egypt with the gold and with the treasures of Egypt. And then he says, "You, Abram, you're going to go to your ancestors, be buried in your old age." And here's the most important verse, verse 16. "In the fourth generation, your descendants will return here, the land, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its limit. Okay, so God has not been ignoring. He's actually been very conscious of the people who are living in the land of Canaan, and he is extremely patient with them. So 400 years or plus or minus has elapsed, and now God is going to be using his people Israel, led by Joshua, to go in, and there's two things happening here. God is giving the land to the people of Israel, but he is also judging, and he is removing the wickedness from the land. Okay, so those are two really important components that are happening within the book of Joshua. How did Moses write Deuteronomy if it records his death? That is a good question, Roy, and that is a question that some German guys especially asked a couple hundred years ago, and that question is one of the questions that led to what we refer to as higher biblical criticism, a field that began to kind of approach the scriptures in a new way. And so those people would say that Moses himself didn't actually write all of the books. There's some other places. One of my favorites is where it says Moses was the most humble man who ever lived. And so if he was actually the most humble man and he wrote that himself, that would be kind of like bragging, right? So so there's some different views about that, but probably some people would say Moses wrote chunks of it, or actually this time writing was just beginning to emerge, and so there were probably some oral traditions, and some of his sayings were written down by other people, and they were compiled and edited and all this kind of stuff. So good question. Thanks for asking. That's the kind of a general answer. We are now ready with that kind of context, the Deuteronomistic history, to begin looking at the book of Joshua, bearing in mind that there's this strong emphasis on the law, okay? The writers want to emphasize the law and the consequences of the law, okay? And also the emphasis on, there's some other things that are featured in there, but the land is really important, kind of a view to the ways that the marginalized are being treated in the land, widows and poor people and orphans and stuff like that. Okay, so does anybody else have any questions of clarification before we begin with the book of Joshua, or does my colleague Reverend Kasoy, would you like to say anything?
Yes, I just want to emphasize the purpose for the book of Deuteronomy. As you have said, it is the second reading of the law, which is being given to the new generation after the older generation had perished during the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Yes. So this is a new generation that needs the law of the Lord, because God wants to be in a relationship with them, and so they need the law to guide them. And also, it's another way of also preparing them to go into the promised land, because they are going to meet many religious challenges as they settle into the land, and they need the law to safeguard them from the religious infiltration, or those bad elements from other religions, the bad worship of the idols and the like. So there is that reputation of the law to safeguard the people from false beliefs and from punishment. Yes, from God. That is what I would want to say. The issue of Moses writing parts and chunks about his own death, I think from what is believed, there are editors. And as you have said, there was the compiling, and then there was the final editors who came, and they must inserted that. But before these things are written, they circulated as oral tradition. And so it is possible that was part of oral tradition circulating before it actually went into writing.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you for those very helpful remarks, Reverend Kasoy. I appreciate that. Does anybody else have any questions before we begin with the book of Joshua? Okay, then let us begin. The book of Joshua, its themes, or it can be summarized as kind of entry into the land and then settling this promised land that is given, or some people would prefer to use the term conquest of the land and then settlement of the land. Traditionally, the book of Joshua is dated from about 1240 BC to 1225 BC. And one of the most important concepts that you need to know and write down, please, if you are taking notes, this will definitely be on an exam, is the idea of holy war. I have just put it into the chat. Sometimes this is referred to as Sacral War. And this is not just something in the Bible or for the people of God. This was common in the ancient world. And it's the idea that the people are not fighting for themselves or because it's their own idea or even in their own strength or in their own power, but rather they are fighting at the directive of a deity, and they are being somehow animated to do that or helped by a deity, and they are doing it for reasons of obedience because they believe that the God has told them to do that. And so that is one of the big ways to understand Joshua, and it has some other implications. One of the implications that scholars talk about, which is very important, is that God himself is doing the fighting. You'll see sometimes in different texts about Joshua that God is a divine warrior. I've put that in the chat as well. And this is significant. We'll come back to this at the very, very end of the lecture. I will kind of circle back around and try to address some very serious criticisms that people make about the book of Joshua. But you remember, I hope, when we had the patriarchal lecture that I talked about that word Israel, which means God fights. And so within the book of Joshua, we see at many points, God is giving the strategy for the battle. God is leading the people into battle, and then God is causing the enemies to be scared, and he is causing the victory to occur. So God is fighting. Probably the most famous example of this deals with the city of Jericho. If any of you grew up in church or are familiar with Bible stories, you'll probably remember this story about Jericho. And so God gives very specific instructions. And the way that the whole episode unfolds makes it very clear that it's not the Israelites who are really strong or really good at using their swords or really good fighters or whatever. They're following God's instructions. They're marching around the city and they're doing things like blowing horns and shouting, trumpet blowing. Yes, Patrick, you have just put that in the chat. Very good. And then when they do all these things after the seventh day, God causes the city to fall down. And it's very apparent these people are just blowing trumpets. God is the one who wins the battle. God is the one who does this, okay? So this is connected to the idea of holy war, and it's very important because the Israelites, again, they are entering the land that God has given them, or that God will give them when this is all done. But it's not their idea, and they're not just mad at these people. They're not feeling some type of a grudge. They are instruments that God is using to accomplish his plan and to get rid of wickedness, to exterminate utterly wicked practices that are taking place in the land. And I'll talk more about that in detail when we get to the book of Judges, because we're told about some of the ways that the Israelites, unfortunately, participate in these wicked behaviors. Okay, so in general, the book of Joshua is often talked about as more of a theological book. Some people would disagree about this, but sometimes it's discussed as a theological book rather than primarily a historical book. You may remember way back when we were lecturing on the first 2 chapters of Genesis, Reverend Kasoy and I highlighted that the main purpose of those narratives was theological in nature. So in other words, another way to put that is that they weren't trying to be a science textbook explaining the how of everything, but they were trying mainly to communicate who was creating the world, God, and why he was creating the world, what purpose he had in mind for humans and for creation, and how all of those things would flourish in harmony together. Okay, so that's an important dimension to keep in mind, is that the story of Joshua is trying to communicate a theological message about God fighting for the people of Israel. It's definitely not telling us that Israel is defeating all these people because they're really good or they're really powerful or they're really mighty. It's continuing the theme that we already looked at in Exodus. God is the one who defeats the gods of Egypt. God is the one who is bringing victory to the people of Israel. Okay. Now, the book of Joshua can be divided in a few different ways, but I am going to decide one way to divide it. Chapter 1 is basically an introduction, and as I said, it firmly establishes the authority of Joshua. This is important because there has been a handoff from Moses, who everybody knew was the leader, now to Joshua. Okay. And already in chapter 1 of the book of Joshua, we see some of these threads from the book of Deuteronomy being carried through in this important speech. We see the word of the Lord is communicated through the leader, just like God communicated to Israel through Moses. He's now communicating through Joshua. And also, we are reminded once again about obedience, which is necessary for the victory, for the blessing, for the prosperity of the people in the land that they're entering into. Then we have chapters 2 through 12, which is really the kind of core part of the conquest or the entrance into the promised land. Okay, these chapters describe swift and decisive victories in taking of the promised land. The taking of the land is described in really 3 military campaigns. One of them deals with the central hill country, chapters 6 through 9. The second one deals with the southern hill country, which is chapter 10. And then the last campaign deals with the northern hill country, which is chapter 11. Okay. Now, another important vocabulary word I want to have you write down, I want to have you to share with you, I'm going to put this in the chat, is cherem. This is a Hebrew word, and it's kind of hard to translate exactly into English because it has kind of some multiple meanings. But this is another word that you should remember when you think of holy war. Okay. Normally, when cities are conquered in the ancient world, people take the treasures, the animals, the resources, sometimes the women or other people to use as slaves. And in fact, those are outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 20. God gives his people, Israelites, instructions on how they are to conduct themselves in war, how they are to do warfare. But cherem is a piece of holy war that is relevant, that God instructs the people because of the utter wickedness that is happening. So the word cherem has to do with something that is dedicated or sacrificed or set aside to God through total destruction. And so we see, I'll go ahead and read Joshua chapter 6. This is discussed many places throughout the book of Joshua, but I'm just going to pick one instance, okay? I'm going to read chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. God says, the city and all that is in it must be set apart for the Lord. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all who are with her in her house will live, because she hid the spies. But be careful when you are setting apart the riches for God. If you take any of it, then you will make the Israelite camp subject to annihilation and cause a disaster. What's going on here is that God is trying to communicate partly that these people are so wicked that not even their possessions, not even their riches should be taken and used, because they have to be completely wiped out. And if you don't wipe them out completely, as God made clear in those verses we just saw, then you're going to put the people of Israel at danger, okay? And this is kind of an analogy. This is using physical objects like animals, cows, and gold to talk about a deeper reality, which is, if you do not completely exterminate and wipe out these wicked practices, these habits and these rituals from the land, they are going to creep back in. They are going to poison your community. They're going to make toxic the life that you are trying to set up and establish in this promised land, okay? So please write down that word cherem and make sure that you are remembering that it involves setting aside something for destruction. There's some interesting cases at other places when we get to the book of Judges, where somebody takes an idol or a special item from a camp, and they try to hide it, and they think, oh, this looks nice, but they were actually supposed to destroy it, and then God has to deal with those people. Okay, it's like a sickness that has to be cut off so that it doesn't infect the entire body. Okay. Then the last part of Joshua, the second half, really deals in a lot of detail with, once the land is basically conquered, with how it's going to be divided up among the tribes. Okay, so there are the 12 sons of Jacob, plus then there are Joseph has his 2 sons who were adopted and by Jacob and given their own land also. The tribes, in case you have forgotten, are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and then Benjamin. Okay, so quite a bit of detail about how the land is going to be divided up, where the boundaries are, who gets what, and how it all works out so that it's fair. And this is another instance at which we should observe the theological importance of land being fairly divided and shared and bordering on other lands to promote flourishing. We'll encounter later on in the Old Testament that unfortunately these boundaries and these agreements were not always honored, and that there becomes a point of contention and strife because the tribes are fighting among each other and arguing about the possessions and all these things. Okay, so that is mainly most of chapters 13 through 21, with a few other stories mixed in there. And then in the end of Joshua, chapters 22 through 24 is kind of Joshua's farewell speech and also a covenant renewal. Joshua knows that it may be possible for the people to abandon God or disobey, just as he has seen happen already. And so they renew this covenant to kind of refresh it, and once again reiterate the blessings and the curses that are going to occur based upon whether they obey God and keep the covenant or not. Okay, and so that's very important kind of closing and conclusion to the book, because as we will see when we get to Judges, a slightly different picture is presented, and we're going to deal with some possible reasons why Joshua and Judges present a slightly different portrait. Okay, so that's most of the book of Joshua in just in a quick way. I see a question in the chat from Roy. Does cherem also apply to Saul when he did not destroy everything as ordered by God? If it depends a little bit on which story you're referring to there, but I'm actually not sure. I'd have to know the exact story. We're going to deal with, Roy, the specific type of warfare that is happening here in Joshua. It's actually distinct from the warfare that is outlined in Deuteronomy 20. For instance, one example is that in Deuteronomy 20, it is said that they should only kill the males. The Israelites, when they're doing battles, should only kill the men. I mean, they can take the women and the children and do other things with them. But if you read the first chunk of Joshua, you will see that God says, no, don't spare the women and the children. Completely exterminate them. And so we're dealing with a different type of warfare here, because these are not normal tribes. These are very, very wicked people, clans and tribes that have been wicked for over 400 years, as we saw in Genesis. And God has given them chances to repent, and they need to be wiped out from the land, because what they are doing is horrible, absolutely horrible. I'll mention a few of the things that they're doing in more detail when we get to Judges. So now that we've kind of talked about Joshua, I want to also pass back to my colleague, Reverend Kasoy. I'm sure he has something to add. I'm probably missed something. So Reverend, would you like to say anything else about the book of Joshua?
Yes, I would just want to emphasize that concept of holy war, where God is fighting on behalf of the people. And throughout the book of Joshua, the nation of Israel is very successful once they go into battles, except for a few instances.
Right.
And when you look at the introduction of the book and the ending of the book, you realize that Israel obeyed God throughout that generation of Joshua. And so God will reward them with victory, will reward them with his presence. He will fight on their own behalf because they are behaving themselves.
Yes.
So the holy war has that condition. For God to fight on their own behalf, there is a certain way that they should live, and that way of life is prescribed in the book of Leviticus.
Yes.
That holiness, and the book of Leviticus emphasizes a lot on the life of holiness. And so within these chapters of Joshua, the people are pleasing to God. And this is how the book ends, by telling you, even when you go to the book of Judges, it will emphasize that the people of Israel, they honored God, they obeyed God throughout that period, the generation, and even the generation that followed Joshua, that immediate generation, they obeyed God. And so when you realize that victory is because the people are being obedient to God, yes. And the condition that they were given in the book of Deuteronomy and before is that if you obey God, then these blessings will come upon you. And so victory in war is part of the blessing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Reverend Kisoy.
Welcome.
Anybody else have any questions of clarification about what I've covered? Is it clear? Does it make sense? Are we on the same page?
Something to add, Reverend.
Yes.
Again, because the war belongs to God, whenever the people are going into war, they make an inquiry from God of how to fight the war, right, how to fight the battle. and the prescription or the directives that are given in each situation, they may differ according to what God chooses, because the war belongs to him. He gives direction on how the war will be fought, whether with the trumpets, whether it's by walking, whether it's by singing, whether it's by fighting. Is the one who gives that. And so every so often they have to make an inquiry, particularly through their leader, on should we go for this battle? Should we not? How should we fight? And sometimes there is a period of consecration, a period of prayer, a period of dedicating oneself to God so that he can give direction about the oncoming battle.
Yes.
Thanks.
Oh, very, very helpful, because that emphasizes again that it's not Israel who's making the decisions or in charge of what this entails, the entering into the land. It's God who's in charge, God who does the fighting. So when we get to the book of Judges, right at the very beginning, we are, as readers, kind of struck by something, because I should just go ahead and I'll read the first part, the first, right away, the first verse of the book of Judges. It says, after Joshua died, the Israelites asked the Lord, who should lead the invasion against the Canaanites and launch the attack? And so all of a sudden we are kind of struck. Now wait a minute. We thought the Canaanites were wiped out. We thought that this had been exterminated. And then throughout the book of Judges, we see portrayed the Israelites struggling with things that we thought had been kind of settled or dealt with. And I'm going to discuss some of the different theories or ways that is understood. But before we launch properly into Judges, I'm actually going to go backwards now to Joshua, because that reality, that tension that we encounter in Judges, has caused Bible scholars to reconsider, to ask questions about what's actually happening in the book of Joshua, or how those events actually came to be. Okay, so I'm going to put in three different, we could call them theories of Israelite occupation of Canaan. Okay. And these all have quite a significant, well, they've gone through historical phases, really. The first one is normally called the Conquest Theory, and it was developed by a guy in the early 20th century. And the basics here are that this is basically the theory that tries to take the text at its face value. And in the early 20th century, some archaeological finds apparently seem to support this theory. But this theory, after a few decades, was challenged by certain scholars. And once again, as we've said before, I'm going to provide you with some of these different theories. You remember the different ways that people think about or understand the creation narratives, right? We're trying to expose you to these, but I'm not going to tell you which one I think is correct or which one I prefer, because all of them are born out of some important observations when reading the text. Okay, so what happened is that especially because of archaeological evidence, people began to question if the conquest actually happened as quickly and as decisively as it is described in the book of Joshua. So one of the big ones has to do with the city of Jericho. So archaeologists have found and excavated the city of Jericho. And after they've done that, you can Google, you can look at pictures of the ancient city of Jericho. But their findings did not seem to really connect completely with what Joshua was describing, as far as the walls falling down and this very sudden, this very abrupt kind of destruction of the city. So So archaeological evidence caused people to start asking questions and thinking maybe it actually happened in a little bit different way. And so the next theory that was developed in kind of the mid part of the 20th century is normally called the peaceful infiltration model, or peaceful infiltration theory. And so these scholars suggested maybe there was a bit of exaggeration in the book of Joshua. Maybe the people came into the land and there was some fighting and skirmishing, but really mostly they just kind of peacefully integrated, and in their memory they recall God giving them the land and these victories, but maybe it didn't happen that way. Well, sure enough, after a couple decades, scholars begin to question this theory and point out that this one also has some problems. And some of the main problems of the peaceful infiltration theory are also archaeological, but some other elements, linguistic and what's the word I'm thinking of? I guess religious or ritual, because we don't the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to it seems like there's too much similarity archaeologically, and if the Israelites came from another place and infiltrated, we would have expected them to be bringing things that they had with them from Egypt or other types of goods or whatever. And so it doesn't really seem like a people of Israel came and infiltrated and brought with them a different way of life. This is archaeologically speaking, okay? I'm just telling you the ways that scholars have approached this. So then the third kind of big theory that tends to be, well, this one itself is being challenged now, but this one was for a while kind of in vogue, it's called the peasant uprising, or the social revolution model. Kind of suggests that actually the people of Israel were just hanging out in Canaan. I'm simplifying, but they were hanging out in Canaan for the whole time, more or less, and then they kind of rebelled against the leaders, the oppressive kind of people in charge, and they had a social revolution, and then they came into control. Now, probably one of the biggest critiques of this model is that it imposes anachronistically modern kind of or political ideas that didn't really exist back then. People accuse this model of being Marxist. This idea that the proletariat is kind of rebelling against the ruling class or whatever. Okay, now all of these try to deal with the tension. What we know to be true for sure is that the people of Israel were in the land and for a big chunk of time, and they were in charge. We have tons of archaeological evidence. We have Solomon's temple, which we know was built, and we have other ritual sites that are set up. So we know that the people of Israel, there are two kingdoms. Reverend Kasoy is going to lecture about these next week. There was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We know that to be true. The question is just, how exactly did the people of Israel come to be in those positions? How did they come into the land? How exactly did it take place? Okay, so we're going to continue kind of asking some questions of the text, trying to be critical readers. And so looking at the book of Judges now properly, there are two big ways. There are more than that, but two big ways that people try to resolve the tension between precisely the tension between Joshua and Judges. Okay, one of the ideas is that, as I already mentioned, each book represents a different purpose. This is what some people have proposed, so that whereas Joshua gives a more kind of condensed view of the conquest and emphasizes God's power in providing a swift victory, Judges goes a bit more into the weeds, into the details, and provides a more detailed view of the struggles and kind of the ups and the downs. last night I gave an example of how our memory works. We tend to remember certain things in certain ways. So I might, as a kind of a silly example, I might talk to you about my university time when I was a student at university over a decade ago, and I might say, in just talking to you briefly, that I was very successful and I did a lot of great things, and that God helped me do amazing things and publish stuff, and it was a very good time, and I grew as a person, and it was awesome. Okay, but then if you were to ask some people who were actually there with me, or perhaps go back and read some of the reports or some of the papers that I wrote, it would be evident that there were actually quite a few ups and downs, that I went through periods of difficulty and frustration and depression, and I had struggles, and I felt like quitting, and I had relationships with people, like girls who stressed me out or whatever. And so the even though the memory of it overall, it was clear God helped me through university. I give God the credit because he helped me succeed, just as God helped the people of Israel succeed. But if we zoom in the moment, it felt more like these ups and downs. Okay, so that's one way. I'm not saying that's the correct way. I don't want to. I'll let Reverend Kasoy reveal his cards if he wants to. But the other way, the other perspective that this can be dealt with, which has a lot of merit, I think, is that Joshua depicts the initial entry into the land, while Judges really describes the ongoing struggle to maintain control of the land. And that would include the idea that even if these people were driven out, they're still on the fringes, they're on the border, maybe they're starting to creep back in. And so the people are trying to maintain control of a land that they have already cleansed, that they have already purified, that they have already ridded of these wicked people. Okay, so that is kind of a couple perspectives on how we can understand the relationship between Joshua and Judges. They're clearly related, but these are some of the ways to understand, some of the ways that people look at them. Now, traditionally, this may reveal something here to you if you're paying attention. Traditionally, the Book of Judges is dated from 1200 to about 1020 BC. So if you're paying attention, traditionally, the Book of Judges is regarded as being, the next chunk of time, not just being a retelling of what happened at the period of time in the Book of Joshua. But there is certainly room, and scholars discuss and argue about this quite a bit. Now, I see a question from Charity. You said, kindly repeat the last theory. It's there in the chat, the peasant uprising, the social revolution model. Is that the one you wanted me to repeat?
I think it could be the peaceful infiltration theory.
Okay.
But what I would say, one can go back to the recording and follow up there instead of taking much time to deal with it here.
Yes, that would be preferred. It is being recorded, and the beauty of the recording is that you can go ahead and go back and speed it up. So that would be wonderful. Now, before I go through kind of the elements of the Book of Judges, do we have any other questions about the content that has been covered? Or Reverend Kasoy, would you like to speak to those different perspectives, those theories that I have discussed?
Thank you. What I would say is that there is the issue of the emphasis.
Yeah.
A certain author may choose to emphasize a certain viewpoint. The other one may choose to emphasize a certain viewpoint. For example, in the Book of Judges, we see a lot of the consequence of failing to obey the law. Mm-hmm. And the author seems to emphasize that God is very strict. God is keen on dealing with human sinfulness. God does
Yes.
not excuse the sin. God will deal with it. And on the other hand, like Joshua, God rewards faithfulness.
Yes.
God rewards or blesses the people who walk with him. He blesses them with his presence. He will walk with them. He will provide for them. He will do things on their own behalf. I think
Yes.
that is an important point, a matter of emphasis. That is
Yeah.
what I see,
That
theological emphasis.
that's a wonderful insight, Reverend Kasoy, and it certainly matches up. If this is a Deuteronomistic history, if this is kind of the work of some people who wanted to connect the dots from Deuteronomy, it matches up very well with Deuteronomy chapter 28, which outlines the blessings and the curses. And so first we see the blessings, people obeying God and being blessed and doing well and prospering and being victorious. But then we see in a very kind of ugly way the consequences of sinfulness and disobedience outlined in the Book of Judges. Thank you very much for providing that perspective. Anybody else would like to voice a concern or a question before I move in more detail in the Book of Judges? Very well. I will just assume that you are all absorbing these things and it's all making good sense. So I said the Book of Judges is traditionally dated from 1200 BC about to 1020 BC. And I should first mention, I suppose, that this period of Judges is kind of an in-between period. We had in the Torah, we had prophets, patriarchs who were governing the people, who were leading them, who were guiding them. And soon, next lecture, next week, we are going to enter the time of the kingdoms where the people of Israel are ruled by actual kings. But in this period, they are ruled by people who are called judges, or we call them judges at least. That word judge in the Hebrew, shofet, is actually only used. The noun is only actually used once in the Book of Judges, but it's the verb form of that word, shafat, which is connected to the actions of these people we call judges, and that verb, in its narrowest sense, deals with judging, like a person in a courtroom making decisions on legal cases, but it actually has a broader meaning, which refers to it kind of deals with the general exercise of legitimate rule. And these judges are raised up by God, we're told, and they are leading the people. Sometimes they make legal decisions, but more largely they're leading the people, often in military campaigns, leading them to victory, and they're guiding the people and helping them return to God, to be obedient once again to God. Okay, now it's very interesting because it kind of speaks to the point that Reverend Kasoy made about emphasis, or emphasizing the kind of consequences of obedience and disobedience. The stories are arranged in Judges so that we get a bit of kind of back and forth and alternating between examples of good leadership, like Othniel and Deborah and Jephthah, and then we have examples of not so good leadership. For instance, Ehud and Gideon and Samson is kind of probably the worst. And these alternating stories get into, it's a very cyclical pattern. There's this pattern in the Book of Judges that I'm going to talk about more. Let me quickly tell you, there's 15 of the judges. Let me quickly read them off to you. They are Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. Okay. Now, some of you, if you're familiar with the Bible, you probably will remember stories about Deborah, about Gideon, about Samson. Okay. These people have some very dramatic events happen, dramatic things that they accomplish, and as they're leading God's people. But I want to read for us in the book of Judges. There are many examples of these cycles, that these patterns that go through. So I want to read for you probably one of the shorter examples, so it doesn't take too much time, and then I'm going to discuss the basic elements of this pattern that we encounter in the book of Judges. So I'm going to read from Judges chapter 3, starting at verse 7, and I'll go through, I'll read about 7 verses. Okay, so pay attention to all the different things that happen here. It covers quite a bit of time, just these few verses. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot, they did not remember the reminders. They forgot the Lord their God and worshipped the Baals and the Asherahs. The Lord was furious with Israel and turned them over to King Cushan Rishaitham of Arman Haraim. They were Cushan Rishaitham's subjects for 8 years. When the Israelites cried out for help to the Lord, he raised up a deliverer for the Israelites who rescued them. His name was Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Lord's Spirit empowered him, and he led Israel. When he went to do battle, the Lord handed over to him King Cushan of Arman, and he overpowered him. The land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Starting in verse 12 again, the Israelites again did evil in the Lord's sight. The Lord gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel because they had done evil in the Lord's sight. Eglon formed alliances with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. He came and defeated Israel, and they seized the city of date palm trees. The Israelites were subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. And then the Israelites cried out for help to the Lord, and he raised up another deliverer from them, and this judge, Ehud, again leads them to victory and leads them back to obedience to the Lord. So if you read the book of Judges, you will encounter this pattern again and again and again. Let me tell you the 6 basic elements, okay? The people of Israel sin. Israel then is delivered into the hands of an oppressive enemy, and they are being ruled by that enemy for a period of time. Then the people of Israel cry out. If you remember from our previous lecture, the people of Israel were in Egypt, and God heard their cries. They cry out. Okay, this is the same connection here. They cry out to God because of their oppression. Then God raises up a deliverer or a judge who frees them from the enemy. Then Israel experiences freedom and prosperity for a period of time. Normally, during the lifetime of that judge who is leading them well, they are close to God and they are obeying him again, and there is peace and things are good. Then after that judge dies, after that generation perhaps forgets, the people of Israel sin again, and the cycle starts all over. Okay? Now, as we read this, if you read the whole book of Judges, sit down in one sitting and read the whole thing, it will make you frustrated and it will make you weary, and you will think, why can't they just be obedient to God? Why do they keep forgetting? And it's supposed to make us weary, because that's how the people were feeling as well. And later on, the people, when they are sent into exile, okay, they are remembering these stories. They are reading these stories about judges, and it's clear to them. They're thinking, oh, why couldn't we have just obeyed the Lord? Why did we keep sinning and sinning and sinning? This is what caused us to go into exile. Okay, so this, hopefully, this is an emphasis, this is an example, a very detailed example in the book of Judges about the consequences of sin, the consequences of wickedness. And hopefully it can be a negative reinforcement. I think there's the Intro to Psychology course that happens on Tuesday nights. Maybe you are learning about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. This would be an example of negative reinforcement, trying to help you remember to do the right things, to be obedient through negative examples. And this was a very, very saddening time for the people of Israel and for God. Now, one of the ways that Israel is led to sin and to be disobedient with God has to do with sexual immorality. And so I'll put in the chat two more important words that you must remember. These are vocabulary words that you will most likely be tested on. I am putting in the chat Baal and Asherah. Okay, these are two of the kind of foremost Canaanite deities. And in their mythology, the belief was that Baal is sent into the underworld, and because Baal is connected in part to fertility of the land, the land suffers when he's in the underworld, and so his consort, this female goddess, this deity Asherah, has to come rescue him. And after he's rescued, they have sexual relations, and that is what causes the land to be fertile again. So scholars refer to this as a mythic cycle. Every year, the Canaanites believed that as the seasons progressed, that this myth was kind of working itself out again, and so the land would be dormant or not fruitful. And in the springtime, in order for the land to be fertile, in order for their crops to grow, in order for them to survive, Baal and Asherah would have to go through the same process of sexual relations. And so the ways that the Canaanites worshipped Baal and Asherah is by themselves engaging in these illicit sexual activities. And that is why in the verse I read to you, in the passage I read, it talked about the Baals and the Asherah poles. Okay, these are basically cultic shrines or idols or sacred trees where these acts were carried out. And they believed that by doing these things in public, in a ritual sense, this is how they worshipped, that this would please Baal and Asherah, and that it would cause their lands to be fertile, and that their crops would succeed. So sexual activity in the Bible is a very important theme, and Paul tells us later on in the New Testament, or he articulates in a very clear way, one of the reasons why it is so significant is because when you are sinning sexually, it's not an outward sin. He talks about the way it affects our bodies and the way that it makes the temple of God, or in the Old Testament, we are created in the image of God. The way that it mixes things in this very visceral manner. Okay, and Reverend Kasoy mentioned in the book of Leviticus the codes of holiness and the outlines for how the people of Israel ought to live. And so in Leviticus 18 through 20, I'll go ahead and put that reference in the chat. These things are spelled out in great detail. And right at the beginning of Leviticus 18, okay, something very significant is said. I'll go ahead and read it. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, I'm the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you have been living." Okay, that's looking back. "And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am going to bring you." Okay, you must not walk in their ways. And then it goes on to list all of these wicked things that they do in the land of Canaan. And this involves, illicit sexual activity. This is not activity that was being done between a husband and a wife in the privacy and in the intimate space of their own home. But some scholars, but then there's other things, many other things. If I would encourage you to read through those chapters if you want to get an in-depth idea of just how wicked the people were in the land of Canaan, and why God wanted to wipe them out, because they were causing human life to become degraded in such a great degree that it was breaking God's heart. But some scholars have made an interesting connection between prolific, illicit sexual activity and the ways that that would have caused a lot of children to be born, not just out of wedlock, but also in circumstances where they were between tribes, where they did not have a clear identity or a clear home, where they did not have a system to care for them. So when Israel, especially when Israelites would participate in these ways, when they would engage in sexual activities with people, with other tribes and other clans, and children were born out of that, then these children were caught in between the ways and the life of Israel and their customs and their language and the ways of these other people. And one of the horrific, probably one of the most horrific things that occurs in the land of Canaan, one of the most horrific sins, is child sacrifice. Okay, and that is discussed in that passage in Leviticus 18 through 20. In fact, it talks in detail about the god. I will put his name in the chat, Molech. And archaeological evidence has suggested that this was not just human sacrifice, which is deplorable in itself, but this was child sacrifice. And what we think happened is that these children were burned in honor to this god Molech, an absolutely horrific thing. And so the people of Israel were getting caught up in these things. Honestly, it's a bit difficult for me to understand how somebody could sacrifice, how somebody could burn a child as a sacrifice to Molech. However, it's a bit easier to understand how the Israelites could have been led astray by the offer of these illicit sexual relations, and God knew that. God created us. God is aware of how we operate as humans and what makes us tick, which is why God said so clearly, so strongly to the people of Israel before they entered the land, you must exterminate these people. You must wipe them out. You must get rid of these evil habits, these evil practices, because if you don't, they're going to creep back. You will be tempted to participate in these ways. You will be drawn away from God. These themes are also recurring in places like the Book of Proverbs. It talks about how people can be led astray by momentary, fleeting pleasures that are offered in sexual sin. Okay, so this pattern of sin repeating over and over and over again really is depressing, and the end of Judges does not reconcile or does not provide a neat or conclusive ending. It leaves us in this feeling of unsettledness. And it says at the end of the book of Judges that basically there's just things are falling apart. Everybody did what they saw in their own eyes to be right, to be correct. There was nobody ruling. There was no guidance. We're left with a really depressing picture leading into the books of Samuel and the book of Kings. Okay, so this serves as a very powerful reminder of the consequences of disobedience and the consequences of sin. And you must understand, I want to make sure that this is clear to you all. God is not upset with sin because it is just, disobeying a rule, some arbitrary rule. Like I tell you, don't walk on the grass, and then you walk on the grass and you broke a rule. That is not why God is upset with sin. He's upset with sin because sin by its very nature corrupts and destroys and poisons human life. It ruins human communities. It pulls people down into a way of being that is not free, that is not flourishing. It's like when the people were slaves in Egypt, they could not be who God wanted them to be. They could not live their life in the way that glorified God and offered God worship because they were being oppressed. So sin does that to people. And God gets so upset. What was the word? I can't remember the word I had in my translation. Was it furious? God was furious because the sin is eating away at the people he has created, the humankind who he so carefully and lovingly crafted. We saw in Genesis, and he loves us, and it breaks his heart when sin destroys our lives. Okay, so that is my basic treatment of the book of Judges. And the final portion of the lecture, I'm going to offer a brief, kind of like an apologetic, but I want to break before that, and of course give Reverend Kasoy a chance to add anything or correct anything I've said, and any other questions from the rest of you.
Thank you for that opportunity. I would draw us to how the book of Judges ends. The last verse of that book, chapter 21, verse 25, is very crucial.
Yes.
This is what it says. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit.
Yes.
That spells or summarizes the book of Judges, where everybody is doing what they see as fit.
Yes.
Meaning that they are not obeying the law. They are a standard to themselves. They are not following God's standards. And an important point is that there was no king. That statement, there was no king in Israel, is constantly repeated in the book,
Yes.
probably 3-4 times. There is no king. And this is pointed to a deficit, is pointed to a problem in the life of the people of Israel, the need for the ideal king, the need for the messianic king. And that will introduce us to the next section, where we will be dealing. Now there is a king, the people demanding for a king, and what kind of a king is required, the characters, the qualities, and how that king should govern. Right here, it's pointed that there is a problem. There is no king. And we will see how that messianic king is going to come in place, because the people are going to demand for that king. Right now, most of the problems, they seem to be, there is no king to give direction. There is no king to set standards. No king to interpret the law for the people, no king to do many things and to help connect people to God. Everybody is doing as they are seeing fit. And that is the source, that is the anarchy that we find in the book of Judges. And that will introduce us to the king, or to the kingship, or to the monarchy.
Yeah. Very good.
And I would also want people to think about how the book of Joshua ends. The last chapter of the book of Joshua, I would want to draw us to that ending, chapter 24, verses 31. The emphasis is there for this book.
Yes.
Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua, and all the elders who outlived him, who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Again, that is a caption there for the book of Joshua, that throughout the period that they were led by Joshua, they obeyed God. They served the Lord throughout his lifetime. And so what do you expect if they are serving God? It's what we were discussing in the book of Joshua. An important thing that I may also mention is the meaning of the Joshua. In Hebrew is Yehoshua, which means God is salvation. And so it spells the theme of that book, the salvation of God, where God is saving and delivering his people, because that name, Yeshua, Joshua, is very, very crucial and is related to the theme, because there God is delivering his people, is the savior, is the redeemer, and is acting on behalf of his people because of what we have seen there in the end chapter, that they served the Lord throughout his lifetime. Thank you.
Very, very good, Reverend Kasoy. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay, now I just want to close the lecture by offering a couple perspectives that I hope might be helpful. There's a lot of opposition to Christianity in the world, of course, and in the last few decades, a certain group, sometimes they're called the new atheists, the people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, have drawn new attention and have leveled new criticism at the Bible, and their group and others who are like it often make some very general accusations about the Bible, and the books that feature very prominently in those accusations are often Joshua and Judges. And what they will say about these books involves the sexual immorality, of course, that occurs. But one of the most significant charges that is leveled has to do with the idea of genocide, that God is somehow commanding his people to commit genocide. And that is a heavy accusation. It's beyond even just the accusation that God is condoning violence. So I want to just offer a few thoughts about that, because if you, after you finish university, and if you continue to walk as a Christian, you are likely to hear these criticisms about the Bible. So there are several important things to be said about this accusation of God condoning violence and genocide. The first, I will just remind you all, has to do with the utter wickedness of the nations, and actually, I will speak in just a moment about the ways that these are not even normal nations or tribes or people groups. They are a different degree of wickedness. But we saw in Genesis chapter 15 that God said the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet fulfilled. And so that was 400 years prior. God was waiting, and we have indications in other places of Scripture that God was working to help these people repent of their wickedness. We see that very beautifully demonstrated in the book of Jonah. This very wicked place called Nineveh, God sends Jonah and asks them to repent. And guess what? This wicked city called Nineveh, they do repent. They do. So God is not just instructing the Israelites to kill people who are somehow breaking the rules. There is this deep, deep level of wickedness that is destroying human life, destroying human flourishing, destroying the lives of children and women. Okay. And God waited for over 400 years. Okay. The second point has to do with the commands, actually, that God says are to drive out the people. And we see this in Joshua 3, chapter 10, and other places. And there's a bit of a distinction between driving out and between going in and killing. And so there's a bit of a difficulty in discussing this, but some scholars think that if the people had repented and had left, and if Israel had been able to drive them out, then there would not have been need for violence. We see this actually in Deuteronomy chapter 20 again, the guidelines for warfare. It talks about trying to negotiate with people, and if they resist, then there is license for violence. And so that's another thing. It's definitely not correct to talk about genocide because for a whole lot of reasons I don't have time to get into, but they didn't even really think about race or ethnicity in the same way that we think about those terms now. That it's a very anachronistic way to view the scriptures. But I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. Another important point is that oftentimes secular people who are concerned about this narrative of violence from the oppressors completely misses the reality that the Israelites were the opposite of oppressors. They had been oppressed in Egypt, and they were scared. They were terrified of these giant people living in the promised land because they were the ones with the big cities, the big fortifications, the Jerichos. So the Israelites are actually the underdogs in the story. They are the weak ones. I mentioned in my last lecture about how God delights in using weak and small, insignificant people to accomplish his purposes. And that we see that once again in this story of Joshua, because the Israelites are the underdogs. They are the weak ones. Some people talk about a theology of weakness. And God seems to do this so that he can emphasize all the more clearly to the nations around and to the world that God is the one who fights for Israel. It's not because Israel was strong. It's not because they had great weapons or chariots or fortifications, okay? It's because God was fighting with them. Sometimes people, to that point, they will also accuse the Bible of condoning Christians or Jews or whoever claims the people of the book, condoning them to be violent or to enter into warfare. And that is not true for all of the reasons we have said already, but God is the one who does the fighting, and God is the one who leads them into battle. God is the one who causes the victories to happen. And as Reverend Kasoy mentioned, it is never up to the decision of the Israelites completely, alone or apart from God. God is the one who is directing and who is giving permission and giving the guidelines of how the holy war should be executed, should be carried out. Okay, and now the last point is the most unfamiliar and the most difficult to talk about concisely because it involves so much. But I've mentioned a few times, I've alluded to this idea that the wickedness of these people was a special type of wickedness, that they're actually not even normal nations who are apart from Israel. These are a special type of nations or groups, and the reason for that goes again back to Genesis, all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. We are told, I don't remember if we discussed this in our lectures, but very briefly, we're told in Genesis chapter 6 that sons of God, these rebellious angels, come down and they have sexual relations with women, and that the offspring of those relations are these beings called Nephilim. And we're told in several places in the Bible that these Nephilim are giants. So I can read for us from the Book of Numbers 13:33. Maybe I should put that reference in the chat also, because this is significant. Numbers 13:33 is just one of the places. I'll read it very quickly. It says, "We even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers to them." So this is recounting the spies who are sent out, Caleb and and they come back with this report that the people occupying this land are scary, and they are huge, and they are giants, and not only are they intimidating because of their size, but also because we learn later on their technology and their weapons. And so I don't have time to spell this out, but many of the people described in the book of Joshua are linked with this group called the Nephilim. We're told at several points about their size or their stature or their descendants or where they're coming from. And their size does not make them wicked. What makes them wicked is the fact that they continue to carry on the rebelliousness that is encapsulated in these fallen angels, and they are continuing to be influenced by the worship that they encourage. And so that is why this is a special type of wickedness. And in fact, this would be connected, or should be connected, to the flood, because one of the big reasons for the flood was precisely to wipe out this type of wickedness. I'll leave you to wrestle with or think a little bit about how these giants are still remaining after the flood. But of course, we know even in the period later on, several hundred years later, when King David comes around, he defeats a giant, Goliath, who comes from the Philistines in Gath, which is this place associated with these wicked tribes that are worshiping these giants, practicing these wicked behaviors. Goliath has a brother. Many people don't know that, and there are other giants listed in the passage. And so the Israelites, as I said, the book of Joshua has a dual purpose. God is giving the land to the people of Israel, but he is also using the people of Israel to drive out the wickedness that is existing in the land. And so if we understand that this is a very special type of wickedness, nobody today would condone child sacrifice or many of the other horrible things that were occurring. God was judging these wicked people and wiping them out so that wickedness would not continue, so that harm would not continue to befall innocent children and innocent lives. So those are just a few comments to make, kind of a little apology for these books, which are often misread by people who are reading the Bible in a superficial way and out of context. Shepherd, I saw that your hand was raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, I've got a question regarding the Nephilim.
Okay.
According to Genesis 6, as you stated, I once read it regarding the angels having sexual intercourse with the people. So we see that the same group of giants was seen by the spies that went to Canaan. So is this telling us that these are the same generation? Is it the same generation that continued? Because there was destruction of people by the flood, right?
Right. So that's a tricky issue. I can't answer it all here. I think I've mentioned before that a lot of the ways scholars try to address this is from an extra biblical sources called the Book of Enoch, which is actually not one book. It's a number of different books that have been collected together. Those sources were written before Jesus. They come from the intertestamental period of Judaism, or the second temple period. But we don't know for sure. Those things are not spelled out in great detail in the Bible. What is clear, however, Shepherd, is that a unique kind of wickedness is occurring in the land. And I mentioned, if you read Genesis chapter 20, it says you kill the males, but you should spare the lives of women and children. But those many other instructions for warfare listed in Genesis chapter 20 are actually disregarded in the book of Joshua. And so we are to understand that this is a different type of warfare that is happening because God is expelling wickedness that is a very serious problem. Okay?
Yes. I still have another question, if you can allow me.
Let me hold on just for a moment. Let me see if there's anybody else with a question, and then I'll come back to you. Does anybody else have a question about the material we covered in Joshua or Judges they would like to ask before we end? Anybody else? Okay, then Shepherd, what is your other question?
I would like to know if these people, the Nephilim people, the first group, according to Genesis 6, are these recognized as people of God, since it was a mixture of wicked angels, the fallen angels? Are they the fallen angels, to be more clear on this?
They are not, the Nephilim are not fallen angels. They are the results of what happens when the fallen angels have sexual relations with human women.
Okay, but are they recognized? Sorry, my question is, are they recognized as God's people?
I don't know what you mean by that. God's people. What do you mean?
Look, God created the human beings. Angels were created differently from people, as the Bible tells us that the angels were created different. And also they were in a falling nature. So for them, and I think it was illegal, according to God's point of view, for them to come and have this social sexual activities with the human beings. So that is why I'm saying to be recognized. Like, can God redeem such people?
Can God redeem such people?
Yes.
That is an interesting question. The reality, Shepherd, is, and I don't want to talk about this too long because it's not directly related to our material, but the reality is that the Bible simply does not give us much detail about the Nephilim. And so what I would say to you in answer is that because these Nephilim are a bit mysterious in the Bible, probably what happened is that a tradition sprung up to try to write and to hear a bit more about them, and that is the Enochic traditions, the books of Enoch, and they try to answer the questions that you're asking, but the questions that you're asking cannot be definitively answered by the Bible alone. Okay, that's just the reality. So thank you everybody for your presence here in the lecture. I'd like to draw things to a close, and I'll hand off to Reverend Kasoy if he has any final comments, and then I would also like Reverend Kasoy to close us in prayer, please.
Thank you. I would want to indicate the issue of Nephilim. These are viewpoints. These are arguments or explanations that have been developed by people. And this is the human attempt to come to terms with what has been written. There's wrestling, and this wrestling continues on even as we wrestle. So this is one of those wrestling, the human mind wrestling to come to terms with what is written here. And that is just one viewpoint. It is a perspective that has been developed. There are also other perspectives to the same or regarding the same, that these Nephilim are not angelic beings. They are just wicked human beings. And when we talk of the language of giants, sometimes the Bible will talk of big, huge people in that sense. And there are different viewpoints on this. So we would not want you to take this as gospel truth. We are simply telling you these are theories that have been propagated, and you need to see them as theories. We are not telling you that this is a gospel truth. So we cannot build dogma.
Yes.
We cannot build doctrine on this. So these are just viewpoints, and you need to take them as viewpoints.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. And I will ask Anton Macau to close with a word of prayer.
Okay.
Oh, Anton, you don't have a mic. And let's have Wanjiku Yvonne to close with a word of prayer.
Okay, let's pray. Almighty Father, we come before you this evening. Thank you, praising your holy name. Thank you for the lesson that we have just had. Thank you for everything that we have learned. May we be able to remember it for the coming examinations and for the test and for our life experiences. For our lecturers, may they be able to continue in knowledge and to continue to help us as well. We pray all this believing and trusting in your holy name. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
In 2 weeks,
Thank you.
Amen.
We have good
Amen.
night, everybody.
in 2 weeks, expect the study guide for the final exam. In 2 weeks.
Very good. Blessings, everyone. We'll see you next week as Reverend Kasoy lectures on the beginning of the monarchy.
United Monarchy.
Yes, the monarchy of Israel. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Okay,
Good
good
night.
night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.